Hey everybody, this is our next week of our chronological Bible study, Full Circle Redemption. This is week 27, video number 26, and this is the study of day 176 to day 181 in the chronological study Bible. Or if you're going by the dates, this is the video for June 25th to June 30th. All right, we are getting near the end of the divided kingdom era as represented in this chronological study Bible. You can see through the past few weeks we've been reading that the kingdom of Israel, as it left the hands of Solomon, as Solomon passed away, it was divided into two separate kingdoms. The northern kingdom, which was ruled by kings who were not descendants of Solomon, and then the southern kingdom, which became Judah, which was ruled by the descendants of Solomon. And all of this takes place within the horizontal books. Remember, horizontal books move time forward. The horizontal books that we're in is 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. Throughout this time, we've interacted with various prophets. We had Jonah. Jonah went to Assyria and warned them to repent, and they did. God was preserving Assyria a little while longer so that they could invade and be used as a tool to punish Israel, the northern kingdom, for their falling away, for their idolatry and all the things that they had done for hundreds of years in rebellion against God. And then we read the other prophetic books of Amos, Hosea, Micah, that were all warning Israel and Judah of their pending destruction. Not only will the northern kingdom be wiped out by Assyria, the southern kingdom, or Judah, will also later be destroyed by another rising power called Babylon that's coming up behind them. Meanwhile, you had Isaiah, and Isaiah had a similar message. However, he hit on a lot of other topics as well. Isaiah gives them those same messages, but on a much broader view. Isaiah not only prophesies about the doom of Israel and Judah, but also he begins speaking of a coming Messiah, a holy branch who will grow out of the stump that Israel will become. Prophecies like a child being born of a virgin, his name will be God with us, comes from Isaiah. The prophecy that the Galilee, which was inhabited by Gentiles during this time, will be filled with glory. And we know that's Jesus' hometown when he is walking the earth for those 33 years. Isaiah said the government will rest on his shoulders. He will be a wonderful counselor, a mighty God, an everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. And that's speaking of the Jesus that we're waiting on in the second coming. It says that he will rule from the throne of David. And as we know that Jesus sits at the right hand of God, but he will then, again, during the millennial reign, will come to earth for 1,000 years and sit on the throne of David and will rule from Israel. Isaiah also assures the people of Jacob that from them, after all the pending destruction that's coming on them, a remnant will remain. And that remnant will remain because God made those covenants with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob way back in the book of Genesis that told them that he would preserve them, and he would multiply them, and he would give them a land, and they would be secure in that land. And God always keeps his promises. And as we're about 730 BC, if we focus on the kings that are in power right now, we're at the tail end of Ahaz's reign in Judah, and his son Hezekiah is taking over as king. And in the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, we're getting near the end of that kingdom with the rule of Pekah and Hoshea. And Hoshea will be the last king of the 20 kings of the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, if we back up and we look at our history that has already come to pass, if we go back to Babel, where all of the nations were split, where the languages were confused and the people migrated around the earth, one of those people groups that came out of Babel were the Chaldeans, of the Chaldeans. This is where Abraham originally came from before he moved over into the land of Canaan. So you have the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans then grew. This is in modern day Iraq. And the Chaldeans then grew, and then at some point the Assyrians split off from the regular Chaldean people, and they made an independent kingdom. And as we know from last week, Assyria is in northern Iraq. Their capital was Nineveh. So then we progress through our time in Assyria, you see, as a separate kingdom, and in the rest of Chaldea, the southern part becomes Babylon. So now you have two distinct groups. You have the Babylonians and the Assyrians that come from this nation of Chaldea. You see throughout history there are several times where the Babylon and Assyria are united, and then they split apart again. And then as we progress into here, we see in the time that we're in right now, is right around in here, Babylon and Assyria are still two different kingdoms. Assyria will invade, like we said, the northern kingdom, and then Babylon will then overtake Assyria, and then out of that will come the Babylonian Empire, which is represented here with the king Nebuchadnezzar. And that will be the next era in our study where we talk about their captivity in Babylon. Babylon will then be overtaken by what the Bible calls the Medes and the Persians, and that's represented by this green empire that we haven't quite got to yet. That's on the next page. So not to get too far ahead of ourselves, we have the Assyrians who are now taking over the northern kingdom. Later, all that will be left in Israel will be Judah, and at which point when the Babylonians conquer the Assyrians and they take over that whole region, the Babylonians then will take over Judah and conquer Judah, and they will exile the Judeans. And then while the Judeans are in exile, the Medes and the Persians will join forces and conquer Babylon, which will bring the Persian Empire on. Simultaneously, you have Athens and all the city-states of Greece, all the nation-states of Greece who are now splintered. Sparta, Athens, and all the multiple Greek nations out there who will be united underneath Alexander the Great, who will then overtake Persia. And at this time, the very foundations of Rome are being laid. And their mythology tells us that there were two brothers, Romulus and Remus, who were fed by a she-wolf. And out of those two, they will go to battle, and Romulus will then become the king of Rome. Rome will then grow in power, and it will eventually overtake Greece. After this time, we're going to go through Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. We're going to go through 4 different empires before we get to the time of Jesus. So aside from all the prophecy that we've already talked about, let's focus back in on our chronology, the books that are moving the time forward, that are giving us the storyline of all these different events that I just showed you on these charts. So in 2 Chronicles 28, verses 16 through 21, we find out that at the time King Ahaz, now this is King Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah, King Ahaz of Judah asked the king of Assyria for help. So the king of Judah then is asking the king of Assyria for help. Remember, in Judah is Jerusalem, and inside Jerusalem is the temple, and it's a place of importance with a lot of treasure. Verse 17, it says, the armies of Edom had again invaded Judah and taken captives, and the Philistines had raided towns located in the foothills of Judah and in the Negev of Judah. They had already captured and occupied Beth-Shemesh, Ailon, Gederoth, Soko, with its villages, Timnah with its villages, and Gimzo with its villages. The Lord was humbling Judah because of King Ahaz of Judah, for he had encouraged his people to sin and had been utterly unfaithful to the Lord. So when King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria arrived, he attacked Ahaz instead of helping him. Ahaz took valuable items from the Lord's temple, the royal palace, and from the homes of his officials, and gave them to the king of Assyria as tribute. But this did not help him. In 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 10 through 18, it says, King Ahaz then went to Damascus, which is in Aram, to meet with King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria, because remember, Assyria had already taken over Aram by this point. And while he was there, he took special note of the altar Then he sent a model of the altar to Uriah the priest, along with its design in full detail. Uriah followed the king's instructions and built an altar just like it, and it was ready before the king returned from Damascus. And when the king returned, he inspected the altar and made offerings on it. He presented a burnt offering, a grain offering, he poured out a liquid offering, he sprinkled the blood of peace offerings on the altar. Then King Ahaz removed the old bronze altar from its place in front of the Lord's temple. So this was the actual altar they were supposed to make sacrifices on. He removed that between the entrance and the new altar, and he placed it on the north side of the new altar. He told Uriah the priest, use the new altar for the morning sacrifices or of burnt offering, the evening grain offering, the king's burnt offering or grain offering, and the burnt offering of all the people, as well as their grain offerings, the liquid offerings. Sprinkle the blood from all the burnt offerings and sacrifice of the new altar. Bronze altar will be for my personal use only. Uriah the priest did just as King Ahaz has commanded him. And this is totally contrary to what God commanded them to do. Verse 17, then the king removed the side panels and basins from the portable water carts. Remember those water carts that were made so they could move the water back and forth from the spring over to the basin that they called the sea, where they would wash, the priests would wash. He also removed the great bronze basin called the sea from the backs of the bronze oxen and placed it on stone pavement. In defense to the king of Assyria, he also removed the canopy that had been constructed inside the palace for use on the Sabbath day, as well as the king's outer entrance to the temple of the Lord. 2 Chronicles 28 verse 24, it says, the king, this is talking about Ahaz, the king took the various articles from the temple of God and broke them into pieces. He shut the doors of the Lord's temple so that no one could worship there, and he set up altars to pagan gods in every corner of Jerusalem. He made pagan shrines in all the towns of Judah for offering sacrifices to other gods. In this way, he aroused the anger of the Lord, the God of his ancestors. Their society is so polluted by this point with all these other influences. And then his son, Hezekiah, arrives on the scene in about 732 BC. And he jointly reigns with his father for some number of years. And he takes the throne in about 716 BC. So in 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 1, Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, began to rule over Judah in the third year of King Hoshea's reign in Israel. So King Hoshea is ruling in the northern kingdom of Israel. In the third year of that rule and of that kingdom, Hezekiah took the throne of the southern kingdom, Judah. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother was Abijah, the daughter of Zechariah. He did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight, just as his ancestor David had done. He removed the pagan shrines, smashed the sacred pillars, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke up the bronze serpent that Moses had made, because the people of Israel had been offering sacrifices to it. The bronze serpent was called Nehushtan. Nehushtan sounds like the Hebrew term that means snake, bronze, or unclean thing. If we remember back to the function of this bronze serpent, it's amazing that they still have it by this point. But while they were wandering in the desert, they had plague of snakes that they encountered. And lots of people were dying because of the poisonous bites of these snakes. So God tells Moses and Aaron to make this bronze snake and lift it up. And when people would look at this bronze snake, this bronze serpent, they would be healed of these snake bites. But during this time, people had taken that bronze serpent that was made in the desert all those years before, and they had then started to use it as an idol and make sacrifices to it. And because Hezekiah is a reformer, he then sees it as a stumbling block for his people, and he broke up that bronze serpent that they had been worshiping. There's also several places in Israel where it's suspected that Hezekiah covered up things or concealed things that would be stumbling blocks for people. There's an interesting YouTube video you can look out there. If you look for the Temple of Melchizedek, you'll find an archaeologist who has perhaps found the Temple of Melchizedek. And what the hypothesis is that during the time of Hezekiah, people were worshiping there. It may be even the possible place where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. But people were worshiping there, and they were doing some form of idolatry there. So Hezekiah then built over the top of it and then filled it up with sand. So when this archaeologist comes around, roughly 2,700 years later, he finds this room that's filled with sand, and when they start pulling out all the sand, they find this ancient altar that is perhaps the altar of Melchizedek from way back in Abraham's time in Genesis. So interesting. I posted a link on that several videos before, but I'll repost it again. It's really interesting. Give it a watch if you have the time. Verse 5 says, Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before or after his time. During the divided kingdom, Hezekiah is recognized as he is the best king. So it says he remained faithful to the Lord in everything, and he carefully obeyed all the commands the Lord had given Moses. So the Lord was with him, and Hezekiah was successful in everything he did. He revolted against the king of Assyria and refused to pay him tribute. He also conquered the Philistines as far distant as Gaza and its territory, from their smallest outpost to their largest walled city. So Hezekiah, this great reformer, now then is getting things right, despite the fact that his father ruled in a completely opposite way that he does. Meanwhile, while all this is going on in the southern kingdom, in the northern kingdom, Hoshea becomes the king. In 2 Kings chapter 17, we find that Hoshea, the son of Elah, began to rule over Israel, that's the northern kingdom, into the 12th year of King Ahaz's reign in Judah. So before Hezekiah actually took the throne, when Hezekiah's father was the king of Judah, Hoshea became king of the northern kingdom. He reigned in Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom, for 9 years. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, but not to the same extent as the kings of Israel who ruled before him. King Shalmaneser of Assyria attacked King Hoshea. So Hoshea was forced to pay heavy tribute to Assyria. But Hoshea stopped paying the annual tribute and conspired against the king of Assyria by asking King So of Egypt to help him shake free of Assyria's power. And then in 724 BC, in 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 5, we find that the northern kingdom of Israel is finally taken over by Assyria. It says in verse 5, it says, the king of Assyria invaded the entire land, and for 3 years he besieged the city of Samaria, which is the capital of Israel. 2 Kings chapter 18 verse 9 says, during the 4th year of Hezekiah's reign, remember he's the king of Judah, which was the 7th year of King Hoshea's reign in Israel, which is the northern kingdom, King Shalmaneser of Assyria attacked the city of Samaria and began a siege against it. And then in 2 Kings chapter 18 verses 10 to 12, we find in 722 BC, 3 years later, during the 6th year of King Hezekiah's reign, and the 9th year of King Hoshea's reign in Israel, Samaria fell. At that time, the king of Assyria exiled the Israelites to Assyria and placed them in colonies in Hala, along the banks of the Habor River in Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. For they refused to listen to the Lord their God and obey him. Instead, they violated his covenant, all the laws that Moses, the Lord's servant, had commanded them to obey. This becomes a common practice of empire builders. The king will invade, or later on, during the years of Stalin, the president or the ruler will then, he will take people from one location and exile them to another location. In the instance of Stalin, he moved people all around Russia. He moved the people that were from the province of what we call Tajikistan today. He moved them over to the western side of Russia, and then he took people from the western side of Russia and moved them to Siberia, and that was to keep the people from uniting. It was to break them up, because when we exist as we were designed to do in small family groups, if we go back to our study of Exodus, remember we talked about how families become clans, and clans become tribes, and then tribes become nations. And when we exist in that structure for many, many, many years, we become very clannish, where we exist with people that are around us. And through that commonality that we have with the people that live around us, we develop a common culture, a common language, common beliefs, all these things. And as a result of that, that becomes a strength. So these rulers, like this king of Assyria and like Stalin will do later on, they mix the people up so they can't be united underneath a common language and common beliefs and a common culture. So if he mixes it all up, it weakens the strength of the people. And that's what the king of Assyria is doing now by exiling the people of Israel over to Assyria. And at the same time, he takes people from other places in his empire and brings them and puts them in Israel. We've been reading about warnings about this happening and why it was going to happen by these prophets for the last couple weeks. But here in 2 Kings chapter 17, starting in verse 7, we get a snapshot of what they did to deserve this. We'll see how Judah kind of follows in the same pattern eventually as well. It says, the disaster came upon the people of Israel because they worshipped other gods. They sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them safely out of Egypt and had rescued them from the power of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. They had followed the practices of the pagan nations the Lord had driven from the land ahead of them, as well as the practices the kings of Israel had introduced. The people of Israel had also secretly done many things that were not pleasing to the Lord their God. They built pagan shrines for themselves in all their towns, from the smallest outpost to the largest walled city. They set up sacred pillars and Asherah poles at the top of every hill and under every green tree. They offered sacrifices on all the hilltops, just like the nations the Lord had driven from the land ahead of them. So just like the Canaanite people that were living there before Joshua brought them in, those nations they were supposed to wipe out, and then some failed to do. This has now polluted their society to this point where they are doing the same things that these people that they were supposed to destroy, they're doing the same things that those people were doing. They've been led astray by evil. Verse 10, they set up sacred pillars and Asherah poles at the top of every hill under every green tree. They offered sacrifices on all the hilltops, just like the nations the Lord driven out ahead of them. So the people of Israel had done many evil things, arousing the Lord's anger. Yes, they worshipped idols, despite the Lord's specific and repeated warnings. Now these are people whose ancestors followed a pillar of fire at nighttime and a pillar of cloud in the daytime, and built the tabernacle and saw the pillar of cloud come down out of the sky and go into the tabernacle. These are the same people whose ancestors saw the ground swallow up Korah and the people that were rebelling against Aaron and Moses. These are the same people that saw God fight a war for them in front of them. This is the same people who saw the walls of Jericho fall just by them marching around it 7 times and shouting. They've been given much revelation about God. They have a temple where in their city, in Jerusalem, where their God actually lived inside on the mercy seat, the Ark of the Covenant. How far adrift these people have really come since they've taken over the land that was promised to them. Verse 13, again and again the Lord had sent his prophets and seers to warn both Israel and Judah. As we've been reading, the prophets have come and warned them over and over and over. And what did they do? The kings hated them for it. The people resented them for it. They saw them only as bearers of bad news, negative. They wanted prophets that would tell them what they wanted to hear, tell them good news. Just kind of like today, people want to hear messages in church that make them feel good. When they get up and they leave church, they want to feel good about their lives. When actuality, there's a lot of things that people should be convicted about that we just don't talk about in church anymore because it makes people feel some kind of way. Well, you should feel some kind of way about your sin because all of us are being held accountable for our actions. And you should feel some kind of way about it. And you should ask for forgiveness. You should repent, just as we see him. Because this same God that we have in the Old Testament is still the same God that we have in heaven today. And he's the same God who will judge every person for all of their actions during this life. So a lot of people like to say, oh, well, that's the Old Testament God. No, it's the same God we still have today. It's the God of the New Testament. It's the same God that we have sitting on the throne today. It is. So just because we see this side of him in the Old Testament doesn't change who he is. God is love. Absolutely, He's love. The only reason why we have the concept of love is because it comes from God. But God is also wrath. And if He fails to do what He promises to do, He ceases to be who He is. And He can't do that. So if He says something He's going to do, if He says He's going to hold somebody accountable, if He says He's going to judge people for their actions, He absolutely will. And during this time, He sent all these prophets then to warn them, but they didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to hear it. So the prophet said, "Turn from all your evil ways, obey my commands and decrees, the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey, and that I gave you through my servants, the prophets." Verse 14, "But the Israelites would not listen. They were as stubborn as their ancestors who had refused to believe in the Lord their God. They rejected His decrees and the covenant He had made with their ancestors, and they despised all His warnings. They worshipped worthless idols, so they became worthless themselves. They followed the example of the nations around them, disobeying the Lord's command not to imitate them. They rejected all the commands of the Lord their God, had made 2 calves from metal. They set up an Asherah pole and worshiped Baal and all the forces of heaven. They even sacrificed their own sons and daughters in the fire." We talked about this a few weeks ago with the god Molech. I remember you would place your child in the bowels of this iron idol and then roast your child to death in the bowels of this idol. Or arms, where he was holding your child this way, this idol, and you would roast your child alive. This is how far away these people have fallen from the Lord and His ways. They consulted fortune tellers and practiced sorcery and sold themselves to evil, arousing the Lord's anger. Because the Lord was very angry with Israel, He swept them away from His presence. Only the tribe of Judah remained in the land. So remember we talked about last week, we had this concept that you hear often in society about the 10 lost tribes. Well, the 10 lost tribes just got lost. That was the northern kingdom of Israel that was taken over by Assyria and then exiled, taken elsewhere, and then people from elsewhere were put back in to the land of Israel, the northern kingdom, whose capital was Samaria. During Jesus' time, you will have these people that are referred to as the Samaritans. They're looked down on. Jesus uses them in parables to show the hypocrisy of the priests during their time, because they look down on these Samaritans just because they're there. And Jesus tries to get people to see, and He gets us to try to see through that and see what God really cares about, which is the heart of the people, not where they came from, not the people that they descend from, not all that. So that's how these Samaritans come about. Verse 21, "For when the Lord tore Israel away from the kingdom of David, they chose Jeroboam the son of Nebat as their king." He was the first king of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, the divided kingdom of Israel. Got them off on the wrong foot from the get-go. But Jeroboam drew Israel away from following the Lord and made them commit a great sin. Remember, he set up a different temple. He made the 2 golden calves that they could worship. He made it easy for them. And easy Christianity, easy religion is always false. If it's real, it'll be hard. We live under the rule of a God who has laws and then holds accountable people who do not obey those laws. He's also realized that we cannot stand up to the law. It's not within our capability. We don't have the capacity to fulfill the law, to be saved through the law. Therefore, we need the saving grace of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. We need the blood shed by His only Son as atonement to cover our sins, because that's the only way. Verse 23, it says, "Until the Lord finally swept them away from His presence, just as all of His prophets had warned. So Israel was exiled from their land to Assyria, where they remain to this day." During the time that this book was written, during the time that 2 Kings was written, they were still exiled to this day. Assyria, remember Jonah went to save them from destruction. They were going to be destroyed in 40 days. Jonah went to Assyria to save them from their destruction, that was so that God could use them to invade and do what they've done to the northern kingdom of Israel as punishment for their sin. And that was foretold. It was foretold that Assyria would then afterwards would be destroyed. And that was in Isaiah chapter 10. We read that last week. But this week, now in Isaiah 13, we find that Isaiah also tells us that Babylon will be raised up and then be destroyed in a like manner as was Assyria. So remember when we were looking at the map of the streams of civilization, we had Chaldea, and Chaldea broke into Assyria and Babylon, and they've had these interactions. And we know that Babylon's going to overtake Assyria, and that will destroy Assyria. So there'll be no more Assyria, there'll just be Babylon. But also, Isaiah 13 tells us that Babylon will suffer a similar fate later on. And we know from history that that is Persia. And we'll read about that fairly soon. When we get to the captivity era, Babylon will be, Nebuchadnezzar will be in charge of the region. He will be the king, the emperor of that region during that time. But then the Medes and the Persians will rise up and they will take over Babylon. And that's what Isaiah is talking about there in chapter 13. In the background, behind all of this, far, far, far away, are the Greeks. And the Greeks are building up individual city-states that will be united underneath Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great will take over the better part of the world. And that happens during the intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And we'll talk about that when we get there. It's called the Silent Era in our Chronological Study Bible. And then we just saw in the wall chart of world history, we saw how Rome just got its mythological foundation with Romulus and Remus. And then later, Rome will then rise up and take over what was left of Greece. So there's a lot of history to cover in the coming months, and I hope that you're able to put the Bible, as we're reading it, you're able to put it into this historical context. It'll become more clear as we get into the book of Daniel, because Daniel sees a vision about a statue, and each level of this statue represents each of these empires that will rise and fall. And we'll talk about that when we get there to the captivity era with Daniel. I hope you're learning a lot from your studies, and I pray that each of you are growing closer to the Lord with your reading and your studying, and I hope that I'm helping you in some way understand the Bible better and put it in an actual historical context. There's a reason why people don't know their history today, and that's because the powers that be don't want you to know your history. Because it's very hard, it's very difficult to rule over a people and get a people to do what you want them to do if they know that everything you're doing has already happened before in the past. So if you can make them forget their history, everything happens new. Everything's new, and they have no foreknowledge about what is happening, and you can surprise them. You can pull the wool over their eyes because they've never seen it before. But the Bible teaches is that the same things keep happening over and over and over. We read that Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes that there's nothing new under the sun. We keep repeating the same patterns over and over. And we do that because these ruling powers, they want us to forget our history. They want us to forget the Bible in a historical context. They don't want us to read it in a literal context where we can actually apply it to our history. They want us to see the Bible as just this book of truths, just this good book of truths that gives us good facts about living. Kumbaya, everything's great, but it's far more than that, and it teaches us about the God that we'll all have to stand before someday. Don't let the day that you stand before the Lord be the day that you learn about His ways. Learn about His ways now. Learn His character now. and serve Him while you're here, rather than waiting until you're standing before Him and then learn about Him in that moment. The Bible's out there for all of us to read. It's been here for 1,000 years plus for us to read. Even before that, 2,000 years ago, the apostles were sending out letters across to all the different churches across, and they were going themselves, and they were traveling to all these different churches they have started to tell people about these things that the Bible tells us about. Do yourself a favor. Read it. Read the instruction manual for life, but more important, read the manual that tells you about the God that you're going to stand before and have to answer for everything that you've done during this life. We will see you next week as we finish up the divided kingdom era and we move into the captivity era, and Judah is finally overtaken by Babylon.